What's going on, YouTube, and Happy New Year. Welcome back to a brand new episode of For the Love of Humankind. As always, I am your host, Jeff, and you may notice there is a change of scenery in this podcast episode, and this will probably be the scenery for the foreseeable future. It's interesting because when I started this podcast, I was in a different role. I was in a different apartment. And over the course of me creating this podcast and continuing this podcast, I have had three roles total across the length of this podcast. I have had and lived in three separate apartments across the filming of this podcast and the creation. And it's interesting because, this episode I really wanted to kind of focus on change because, yeah, I'm in a new place. It's a change of scenery. I'm in a new job, which I just finished up really my first full week. And I've been feeling a lot of different things throughout this process. Moved 1,000 miles away from where I was, and moved down into the south, where the weather it's like 70 something degrees today, and back where I was, they're getting like 5 inches of snow, if not more. So it is very interesting to be in this situation and be in this area. After living in the Midwest for 29 years of my life, except for maybe like 5 months. And so over the last week and a half since I've been here and since I have moved, I've been going through a lot of different feelings and a lot of different emotions. And I remember why change can be such an apprehension, or have such like an apprehensive viewpoint towards. Like as people, we don't always like change. We don't always accept change, and it's interesting because when change happens, nobody really prepares you for how you're going to respond to that. Nobody prepares you for what that's going to feel like, what that's going to do to your day-to-day, especially if you have a pet, like what that's going to look like for them and how they're going to adjust, right? Like there are a lot of different things, I think, with change that are terrifying, for lack of a better phrase. And over the last couple of weeks, like it's been an adjustment, right? Like living in the Midwest for 29 years, like would come to Florida for vacation, and I would spend a week here or whatever. And so when I moved down here, like my mindset was like, okay, like I'm going to a warm place. I'm going to be in Florida. Like my mind couldn't get over the fact that I was like living here. It was like, okay, like it's a week, right? Like you're enjoying your time here, and then you go back to what you're used to. But that wasn't the case. And so it's interesting because like my mindset and just like I think my mental health or mentality, a lot of words going through my head right now, like was that this isn't my new normal, right? Like this isn't my new everyday life. And so I felt a lot of like, probably rightfully so, a lot of like imposter syndrome in this area, because I'm like, okay, like kid from Michigan, now in Florida, which I mean is a lot of people do that, but I just felt like, yeah, there's a lot of adjustment, and I'm still putting myself into this community and into this culture around here, and I'm not gonna have it figured out in a week and a half, and that was a weird thing to think about, right? Like, okay, like I don't have to do everything and check out everything in the first few days. I checked out a lot of stuff over the first few days to just kind of get my feet wet of like understanding where things are, what's around here, trying to get to know, places and highlights. And it's interesting because during that time, like, there were days over this last week and a half that I have felt just very, like, out of body. And I get that and have had that quite a bit in my life, where I've had just, like, spans of time where I feel just out of body and I just don't feel, like, all there. And I feel like that's kind of been the case, especially towards the beginning of this week, because I was like, okay, like, there is so much happening and there's so much to learn. And there's just so many things that I don't know that I almost feel like it's causing me this internal crisis of, like, okay, Jeff, like, you got to figure your shit out. And that's not the case, right? Like, and I think that's the thing about change is we all know change is going to happen at some point in our lives, but we don't always know how to prepare and work through that change. And I think that's something that I am learning and trying to figure out too. And this week, like I said, I've been trying to, like, put myself in areas, or put myself, at different local places to try and, like, just observe and see what's going on. I went to a coffee shop last weekend, and I wrote about change and wrote about how I was feeling then, just having, a few days in, this state and in this area. And I wanted to talk about, talk about this, a week later and see kind of how I was feeling. And I think it's very similar still, right? Like, and I don't think that I am going to adjust or that's going to change any time, soon. I think that this is a huge adjustment, right? Like, 29 years in the Midwest, and then I up and leave and I'm somewhere else, right? Like, you don't just, like, you don't just, find yourself in those areas and find yourself molding into that community or that culture or whatever that looks like immediately. And I know I'm talking about a huge change, right? Moving 1,000 miles away, starting a new job, like, those are big changes. And I recognize that. And, whether people like to know it, or, like, recognize this or not, like, we go through change every single day, right? And that, I think, has been helping me kind of cope with the idea that there are these huge changes, but at the same time, like, I am going through other changes every day. And, whether that's a change in the time that I wake up, whether that's a change in how I approach, going into work, or how I approach my workout, or how I, drive to the gym, the path that I take, or, there are so many different, like, small nuances, I think, to change that we don't recognize as change. And we're just like, oh, that's just a daily thing. Like, we switch things up. But, like, those things also matter, whether we give it the type of weight or not, as a move or a job change or whatever. And I think it's kind of sitting in my mind of, man, like, maybe I am okay with change. I know that I've been trying to get out of the Midwest for so long, and, family was a big part of what has kept me in the Midwest. But I was like, I think it's time to just try something new. I didn't want to put myself in a situation where I was just feeling comfortable and I just wanted to be in that same spot or that same area for, a lengthy amount of time. I think I've talked, on this podcast before, and if not, this is the first time. Like, I'm also a huge, like, Disney and Universal person, and so, being in an area that is more accessible to that than in the past, like, that also kind of brings me like some calmness to that, because like that is an area that I know very, very well. Probably like the back of my hand, because I have been there so often. Like I work there, and so for me, and I know this isn't the case for everybody, but for me, understanding that I am experiencing change every day has kind of made these big changes to feel like they aren't as severe. And I know they're huge changes, right? Like 1,000 miles away, like yeah, like it's the whole ass drive, like. So it's been weird. Like I wanted to sit on this episode and talk about, how I've been working through change and how other people might be able to work through change, but I think everybody's going to be different, right? Especially like the way that we comprehend that or immediately accept that change, right? Like if somebody were to say, "Hey, like I want you to pack everything up and pack your life up and move 1,000 miles away," like for a lot of people that may not be possible, right? And I recognize that, and I am trying to think of how, if I had a family, or if I, had somebody who was my dependent and was in school, right? Like, how would that even work, right? People do that all the time, but that just adds so many more layers to your ability to process what change looks like for you. And again, like I'm talking about change in the terms of, moving, starting a new job or career, not necessarily, other things that may change in your life. And I recognize that those changes look very different for a lot of people. And the way that, again, I'm working through that is investing myself and spending time in places that aren't my apartment, spending time after work to go to different places and spend time with people who have been living in this area, and trying things that I haven't done before. Right? Like I was joking with someone before I left Michigan about Dungeons and Dragons, and I was like, "Oh, that's such a nerdy thing to do." And here I am, like investing myself in Dungeons and Dragons while I'm down here, because I'm like, okay, like I'm trying to build community with other people, trying to spend time with other people, and not just isolate myself to my apartment and come home right after work and do that, right? Like I'm not getting any younger, and so trying to figure out like what do I want to do with my life, and maybe this move is gonna, it could be a big proponent of like, okay, like this is what you want to do with your life, and even if it doesn't, right? Like I'm getting new experiences here, and probably going to learn how to navigate different things, and I think that's exciting in itself. Also kind of terrifying, because you just never know what your experience is going to be, but coming in with a cautious optimism, I think is how I would put it, and that like I am excited. I think that there are going to be a lot of things that could be very positive, whether that's in the new job or in the new area, but also I also want to be cautious with that and being like, okay, like you could run into similar situations that you had in the past, right? Like just because you move areas doesn't mean like everything before this area doesn't exist, right? Like there's some realism in that, and understanding and looking back at, okay, how did I manage change before, right? Like most of my change has been, okay, like I moved one state over, or I started a new job that's out of the field that I've been in, right? Like those are changes, and big changes too, but when you completely move across the country, like yeah, like I have been feeling that this last week, and I'm sure I'm only going to continue to feel that, especially the longer it goes between seeing my family, seeing my mom, right? Like, that's a lot. And so I'm trying to figure out how I process that. And I think, continuing to do what I've done in the past and sitting down and writing, filming these podcast episodes, talking to other people who have done that, talking to my friends, like, they still exist, like, they're still there, and that doesn't change. But it kind of looks different, right? And I want to say that change is easier the more that it happens. But I really don't think that's the case. Um, we can experience change so much in our lives, and there are going to be some really positive changes, and there's going to be some really negative changes, right? And the way that I managed change when I was younger probably isn't the way that I'm managing change now. Um, and I think I've put that in my blog before. I've written about that before. Like, we just come with different tools and different approaches. I think the older we get and the more experience we have with different things, and I think this is one of those times, right? Like, if you were to have talked to me, oh gosh, um, 7 years ago, when I was trying to figure out where I wanted to go to grad school, like, I would have been like, oh yeah, like, I still want to be close to my friends that I just graduated with. I still want to have the opportunity to be able to drive home and spend time with family. But now it's like, okay, like, I can accept that this is a great opportunity and this is a chance for me to get out of that comfort zone and try new things. And that's what I'm doing. Like, I'm welcoming change with open arms at this point. I've full sent driving 1,000 miles away from what I'm used to. I am here and I am, getting established and making friends and learning where places are. And that's going to take time. Like, that's not just going to happen in a week and a half. And, the way that we accept change and the way that we accept the things that are happening in our lives, like, it doesn't have to happen overnight. And I think that's what my mind was trying to tell me before when I got here. It was like, oh, like, we have to bring all of this in all at once. We have to accept that this is a thing. We have to know how to live our lives here. We have to know where everything is and be this and this and this. And that's not the case, right? Like, we can take our time. In a world and a society that tells us to continue to keep moving and continue to keep pushing because life is going to continue on whether or not you accept change or not, like, it is okay to take your time. It is okay to sit in your thoughts. Like, it is okay to just sit and observe what is around you, because if this is your new normal and if this is something that's going to last, longer than, a few days or weeks or whatever, you have time. And I know that time is limited for a lot of people. And sometimes that, like, taking time when you don't have a lot of time seems almost impossible, but it's okay to walk. Like, you don't need to run. And I think that's what I'm learning most of all, right? Is I can take it day by day. Like, I don't need to have it figured out right away. And I don't need to have the answers or to know exactly where my favorite coffee shop is right now or the best time to go to, the grocery store or which grocery store to go to. Like, all of these things are going to come in time. And we don't need that right away. Even though our mind wants us to have that and, for us to understand ourselves, we want to have that, I think, sometimes. But it's okay to breathe and take it slow. And that's what I'm learning. Change is about investing yourself in that change and putting yourself into that change and taking your time to process and think about how does this impact me? How does this change, for lack of a better phrase, the way that I do things, or impact the way that I respond to things, or think about how I am going to be different from this experience, right? Like, that's a good thing. It's not always a bad thing, because we are consistently growing and consistently trying to understand who we are in this world when there are so many people and so many overlapping stories. Sometimes we just need to focus on our own. And that can be really hard. Sitting in your thoughts and sitting in your ability to work through it all. But at the end of the day, sit there in that and take your time. So I want to thank you for spending this little bit of time with me today. And, if you're going through change, like, you're not doing that alone. You've got people around you sitting it, processing it, and you've got this. As always, I am your host, Jeff, and we will see you on the next episode of For the Love of Humankind.